My work involves meeting people, hearing their stories, trying to make sense of how they live, and sharing their stories with other people as a way of suggesting that there are, in fact, other ways of living in the contemporary world that we might not expect to have encountered. I became an anthropologist completely by accident. I had never taken an anthropology class in college. I actually went to graduate school to study environmental studies. I was an environmental activist, really from my teenage years onward. So what bothered me in doing activist was that so often what we find are assumptions that seem often not to be grounded in a good understanding of what it is that motivates people. And so I went into anthropology really to better understand human motivation, to better understand why it is that people are so committed to doing the things they do, even if those things can sometimes produce rather difficult consequences, either for themselves or for the larger world in which they live. So we live in an era in which people conceive of our planetary condition as one that's dominated by human agency, by human activity, and by the destructiveness, in fact, of human industrial civilization. I think what an anthropologist can do in the face of stories like that is to encourage folks to stop and ask the question, what alternatives are there? How else are people living? How else are people wrestling with these conundrums? The reason why his idea appealed was because the scale of his existence. How is it that if you simply pay attention to the details of a single person's life, that life can take you from places as far flung from each other? This idea that when you pay attention to something so small as an individual person's life, what opens out to you is an entire world of experience that literally crisscrosses the globe. That was very interesting. And so what the book became was an effort to try to tell a larger history, to tell us a larger story about modern India through the experience of one person who happened to be my grandfather. I spent a lot of time in the company of farmers, shepherds, wage laborers, people who really did have to struggle simply to make a living. And yet, there was something really profound that I encountered time and again, which was the ability of folks who lived in very difficult circumstances to somehow find a certain kind of distance even from what they were doing in the here and now. This idea that people are never simply stuck in a particular moment, that there are always these horizons of possibility, and that so much of life is about those openings beyond the here and now of where we are. And I think that anthropology as a discipline is precisely about those openings. And I think what our task is as anthropologists, is to find those openings, to think with those openings, and to try to give those openings some body in the kind of writing and the thinking that we do ourselves. And that's what I mean by this idea of a humanity yet to come. When I began to spend time in rural Tamil Nadu, one thing that really struck me was the ubiquity of cinema. People were constantly making sense of their own lives in relation to little bits and pieces of the films they had seen. All I wanted to understand was where these films came from. So it was really with a desire to make sense of where these films came from that I began to do for this book, Real World, fieldwork with Indian filmmakers around in India, but also in many other countries as they were shooting on location. And what struck me time and again as I was doing that research is the enormous amount of improvisation that these filmmakers were doing. So what I really began to see is that this creative process of cinema, and really like any creative process, is one that requires a certain kind of accommodation to the world. And so what that book ultimately became was a certain kind of ecology of creative process.